From UFOs to psychic powers and government conspiracies, history is riddled with unexplained events. You can turn back now, or learn the stuff they don't want you to know.
Let us do this. And as you said, it is an underreported story. It takes place in a fairly small town called Mead, Nebraska. In our last Strange News episode, we did a bit of a call out to everyone there in Mead. So let's begin by kind of taking you there. If you pull up Mead, Nebraska on a map, you can see that it's kind of in between Lincoln, Nebraska and Omaha, Nebraska. But if you drew a line between those two major cities, it would kind of be northwest from the center of that line.
It's really small too, right?
It's a very, very, very small town, yes. And we are specifically going to be talking about this tiny little town and an energy company that is by car about 2.6, 2.7 miles away to the south. And we're pulling from a story out of The Guardian. It was written by Carrie Gillum on January 10th of this year, 2021. Here is the headline. There's a red flag here. That's a quotation. How an ethanol plant is dangerously polluting a U.S. village. Okay, so we've talked before on numerous episodes. Specifically, I'm thinking about the one where we talked about the movie Dark Waters, and we interviewed a gentleman who was looking into that story for a long time. We've talked before about pollutants that can come as a side effect of energy production, of what we talked about in the livestock industry episodes, of
manufacturing.
Manufacturing, feeding lots and lots of animals that produce a bunch of byproduct or, waste. Fracking. We've talked about a lot of these problems where there's something that occurs because of a manufacturing process, and then that one chemical then causes great damage to the surrounding area. And in cases like that episode we did previously, you're talking about pollutants that stay around forever.
And just a quick reminder, even for myself, the Dark Waters was the material that was used to make Teflon, to make nonstick pans. And essentially, the company actually covered up some studies that they internally had done to show that this material did leach into soil and stick around longer than anyone would have liked, and showed proof that there were dangerous effects on humans.
Correct. And the bad guys had a lot of money in that scenario. Matt, tell me, history is not repeating itself.
History isn't necessarily repeating itself, but this story is if you took that story and then put on top of it the clothianidin stories that we talked about with the disappearing bee populations across the world. Take those
neonicotinoids.
Neonicotinoids. Take those two, smash them together. That's what this story is. So there is a company called Alt-N, as in alternate or alternative energy. They create biofuel, specifically ethanol. This is something that gets mixed in a lot of times with the gasoline, the fuel that you'd purchase at any gas station for your vehicle that uses petroleum. They use plants like corn that we've talked about, a lot of the high starch grains. They use those. And one specific thing that they use at this plant that a lot of other places don't are seeds that are coated. Okay, so they're coated in something that is specifically meant to prevent those seeds from being eaten by other pests. These are pesticides. These things are coated in this stuff, every one of them. And what Alt-N does is they, quote, recycle these seeds, essentially clean them, make them ready for use in the ethanol creation process. The problem is there is a waste byproduct of these pesticides that were coating the seeds. And what Alt-N has been doing is, or at least what they're accused of doing, and what there's an investigation into right now, is that there are large deposits of these waste products, these pesticide waste products that are just kind of sitting there on the land that were building up over time. and that ended up seeping into the groundwater, seeping into the local waterways, and they were making local residents and animals very, very sick.
It's interesting, though, right? Because, I mean, even the process or the type of fuel is supposed to be more environmentally friendly, right? That's the whole idea.
In some ways it is.
In a lot of ways it is. And this isn't necessarily a bad idea. Alten is making use of these coated seeds in a way that they wouldn't be used otherwise, and they would just end up being placed somewhere if they were no longer viable for planting, right? They would just be discarded somewhere, and probably the same process would be happening just somewhere else. The problem is there's so many of these seeds in one place, and there's so much of this waste byproduct being generated through the process of recycling that it's almost like you're getting a massive concentration of it in one spot.
Mm-hmm. And just for background here, when we're saying pesticides, we'd earlier said neonicotinoids. It is, oddly enough, it is what it sounds like. They're sometimes called neonics, I believe, as well, Matt. These things have been a known issue for some time, but the two quick points I wanted to interject is that first, something like these pesticides are a big part of why we have reliable food production. There are 1,000 problems with it. And second, like we said in an earlier episode or segment, I can't remember, yes, everything in the U.S. runs on corn. We've figured out how to make corn a fuel, but it sounds like we're not cleaning it the way we need to, or cleaning agricultural products in general.
Yes, and in this case, it is a matter of cleaning it. It's just what do you do with that stuff that's left over after it's cleaned?
And I mean, to add another kind of bizarre layer to this, the whole idea of something that is supposed to be good for the environment clearly causing some problems, they have asked or sort of like positioned themselves as a quote unquote recycling center for other companies, other farms, to bring them these non-viable seeds that are like they're referred to as pesticide laden seeds, or treated rather. And essentially what it does is it gives them kind of a free supply chain. So they can like say, oh, well, we're going to recycle them, but also they still have to deal with that waste product because you can't actually feed these grains to animals anymore, right?
That's right. And there's this weird thing going on here, at least according to the Guardian article, where Alten is distributing this stuff out. And they're calling it almost a product that they're distributing it out to farms around their area. They're calling it a soil conditioner. And this is including some of these byproducts. And they're also accumulating a ton of it on the grounds of their plant where they're functioning. So you're saying, okay, this sounds bad. It's some kind of chemical. We don't want that in, our animals or our bodies. What's the effect? Well, residents there in Mead, Nebraska have been noticing a couple things. It started with a smell, just kind of
a stench.
A stench that they weren't normally used to there. It was almost as if something was rotting. And that would make sense because the process to create this alcohol, this ethanol, is to ferment the seeds and the other grains that they're using there. That would make a lot of sense. But then there's this other thing. Irritation of the eyes, irritation of the throat, nosebleeds that were coming on out of nowhere. Then they were noticing that bees were dying off all around the place, including in the University of Nebraska, which is down there by Lincoln. They were noticing bee populations were dying off. Butterflies were disappearing. Dogs, other pets were getting all disoriented and getting very sick. They noticed dilated pupils was one specific thing in these pets that they were causing a lot of concern, really. And here's why. The EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, gives, a safe measure of how many pollutants can be in any water, right? We've talked about this before. Anytime you're drinking tap water, there's stuff in there, but it is so small in the, X parts per billion that you are very much likely not going to be injured by that if you consume a regular amount of water.
Which is not normal in other parts of the world. We're very lucky in that regard.
That's correct.
It's the same way there's like an allowable level of ground up cockroaches that can be found in coffee grounds.
Or rat feces in various products. So, before we get into the urban legends about the percentage of spiders allowed in cereal boxes or whatever, what are the specific parts per billion of these neonicotinoids in question?
Well, I'll read directly from the article here. So the neonics that are allowable within a water source, food and water sources, are 70 parts per billion. You're allowed to have 70 parts per billion parts of neonics in a source for it to be safe. And generally, there are more specifics there you could go into depending on exactly which pesticide in that class you're talking about. But let's just use 70 parts per billion as our benchmark here. There are also benchmarks for aquatic life within freshwater, who are, the aquatic life that's exposed to this kinds of thing. And this is specifically for invertebrates. The neonic known as clothianidin, the benchmark is 11 parts per billion. And for another one called thiamethoxam, that's what it's called. That is 17.5 parts per billion. So very, very, very low amounts are allowable and safe. Here's what they're finding at the Alt-N wastewater lagoon. Clothianidin came in at 31,000 parts per billion in this wastewater lagoon, which is sitting there, which then leaches into water sources throughout, albeit at a much smaller concentration after it's getting filtered through soil, filtered through other things, but there's still going to be a much larger amount of clothianidin in that water. Thiamethoxam, the one I just tried to pronounce and failed, at 24,
you nailed it, actually.
Okay, at 24,000 parts per billion. And there's another one that is dangerous that was also found in the lagoon, which was at 312 parts per billion, which isn't quite as crazy high, but it's not great. And there's another one here. It's called, oh Lord, here we go.
Imidacloprid?
Yeah. Say it again, Ben.
Let's go with imidacloprid, just because that makes it rhyme a little bit.
Yeah.
That may be mispronounced, though.
So imidacloprid, you're allowed to have 0.385 parts per billion in your water, and they found in that lagoon there was 312 parts per billion. Not great. But that wastewater lagoon isn't even the worst part. If you look at parts of the soil on the property, parts of where they're storing some of this stuff, this is what they found. Clothianidin was at 427,000 parts per billion. Thiamethoxam was detected at 85,100 parts per billion. Now that's terrible. And those high numbers are obviously because they are literally taking that stuff off of their product and placing it there, right? That's why you've got these majorly high things. It becomes scary when you put those two together and then you think about the surrounding area and all of the human beings that live there and all the pets. And it just seems dangerous. And there is an investigation going on. The problem is, as we've seen before, it's difficult to have a lot of movement or to get a lot of movement and a lot of action to occur when something like this is happening. The good thing is we actually have an update about what's happening now.
Yeah, there is some potential light at the end of the toxic corn tunnel. A phrase we'll just make up. So Alton took over this plant. This ethanol plant existed before they took over in 2010. And just last week, as we record today, the Nebraska Department of Environment and Energy gave the company Alton 2 months to remove the toxic materials from the plant, at least. But the problem is, I mean, that's good news, right? But
yeah,
the problem
that's great
is
news.
the problem is the pollution has Elvis Presley style left the building already, right? You can clean up the mess in the barn where the horse took a crap, but if the horse already left and is now just crapping all around Nebraska and what estimates say as far as western Oklahoma, perhaps I don't know. How do you, I don't know the science behind how you would go about cleaning the entirety of the area once that, like you said, once that groundwater leaches out.
Yeah, I mean, the closest thing you could maybe compare it to would be the way some of these "quote unquote" Superfund sites are dealt with, places where legacy nuclear waste is stored, and there's these like mandates from the U.S. government to clean up those sites, and they're monitored over time. But that's the key: is it takes time. There's not just like a one quick fix, kind of like, okay, now we're all good. It's like an ongoing process.
Yeah, well, the other big problem is right there in Mead, you're smack dab in the middle of just tons of land that produces food. It produces animals and plants, mostly plants. And it's, if it gets far enough down the chain there, you're just going to have pollution for a while. The other big problem is in 2019, there was massive flooding that occurred in Mead, Nebraska, and the surrounding areas. And if you've got any kind of storage of these materials on land and flooding comes through there, it just immediately gets shoved back into the water systems and then taken and carried further out. It's just, it's not great. What I don't have a lot more to add on this, guys, and I know we need to move on soon. I just want to, put this message out to the folks in Mead, Nebraska and the surrounding areas. If you've seen any of this stuff, if you've got, pets that were affected, if you've been affected or your family, we would love to hear from you.
Oh, and if you are in a similar situation, dealing with something like this in your neck of the global woods, whether in the U.S. or abroad, we want to hear your story as well, because this kind of stuff happens under the headlines. Just under the fold of the proverbial newspaper around the world every day. And there are genuine conspiracies to cover it up.
There are.